Well, thanks everyone. Obviously, thanks everyone for first and foremost sitting and listening. A bit of background on us. My name's Chris from TJB Community. We're a grant support consultancy. So we've over the last 5, 6 years submitted thousands of grant applications and had plenty of rejections. And from that, got a good amount of experience in terms of, I guess, the breadth of funders, the types of things that they want to see, and yeah, built, I guess, a bit of experience that hopefully we can pass that on to you today, particularly if you're looking to put your own applications in or you've got your own projects. Yeah, some experiences there. So firstly, you're going to look at sort of in Cambridgeshire broadly where the funding is. It's obviously there's hundreds and hundreds of grant funds out there, some national, some regional. It's not always very clear on what fits you, but hopefully I'll give you some names of different funders, different bodies that if you're not aware of them, maybe you can go on Google search and see if it's something that would fit your projects. How to develop a project to give it the biggest chance of success before you've even put pen to paper. And then the nuts and bolts of actually putting a high quality application together, and then a little bit of why we feel some bids fail, and that's our bids failing, and the feedback that we get, and again, just increasing your chances of success, and just it's not on there, but just finish with a little bit of a short case study of an example of a hall that we've worked with in the local area. So very quickly, this is sort of our team. We've got different backgrounds, different areas of expertise. We all work across a sort of broad spectrum of not-for-profit, so village halls, community centres, churches, sports clubs, any sort of charities and things like that. Our background is very much before we sort of developed this business is volunteering within our own organisations. So, being in charge of the bid writing for those organisations and then developing into supporting people. And like I say, over the last sort of 5 or 6 years, worked with over 500 different entities up and down the country. So from sort of we've all got organisations from Aberdeen down to Cornwall, some in Northern Ireland. So I have a reasonable understanding of I guess the broader context across the UK when it comes to funding. And like I just said, a refined process more from our failures. The successes are great, but you don't necessarily learn as much from them as you do from when you get that unfortunate feedback that a grant's not been successful. And what we'll go on to talk about is a lot based off that. So firstly, kind of finding the funding within Cambridgeshire. Now, obviously funding is a bit of a postcode lottery. Cambridgeshire is actually one of the areas in the country that's got a lot of funding in it. So that can be a positive, albeit your postcode within Cambridgeshire can obviously impact what you can and can't apply for. Obviously, don't need to go through this. Heidi's just done 45 minutes on that, and we can move very quickly from the biggest funder in the country. You all, depending on the project, should be able to access lottery funding or at least have a chance of accessing it. Um, the Cambridgeshire Community Foundation. I had a quick look this morning just to see how many different yeah grants that there are on there at the moment. I think there's like 30 or 40, some of which are closed, some of which are open. But again, the Cambridgeshire Community Foundation is a great website to check whether you've got a project that might meet some of their funds. They've got funds on there that might be up to £100,000, some that might be just for £1,000, depending on the project. So have a good search on there and obviously check what you may be applicable for. Then we've got landfill funding, and this is probably why Cambridge is probably really strong in terms of options, because a lot of areas might only have one or two waste management companies that can be applied to for accessing the landfill communities fund. Whereas in Cambridgeshire, there's a whole host of different companies. This is postcode specific, so each of these or five of these sites will all be, you put your postcode in and you check if you sit in their geographic area that they'll support. Thalia is Cambridgeshire wide. So as long as you sit in Cambridgeshire, you can apply for Thalia. Thalia is actually administered by Cambridgeshire Community Foundation, and that is a programme up to £100,000. With anything in grant funding, probably the less you ask for, the more chance you've got of being successful because they've got a limited pot of money, and if they can support four projects at £25,000 rather than one project at £100,000, you're increasing your chances of success. Um, Albeit there are projects that the Landfill Communities Fund will support at the values of £100,000, £50,000. So for bigger projects, that becomes a really good source of funding. Our experience, if we were to compare this to um, the Lottery Reaching Communities Fund, if you did have a 70, 80, 90 grand project, I'd suggest that the chances of success with these bodies is closer to kind of a 40%, maybe a 50% success rate. So maybe you've got a higher chance of success if you're kind of under that £100,000 remit. So well worth looking at each of those sites and seeing if you are applicable with your postcode. Sport England's something that our experience is chatting to Village Hall, something that they're not fully aware of that they can apply to. Sport England's had a little bit of a sea change and a shift in terms of their what they want to support. Moving away from traditionally just cricket and rugby and tennis and traditional sports to just physical activity. Um, Now, the majority of village halls that we work with have yoga classes, Pilates classes, aerobics, line dancing, some different iterations of physical activity. Sport England want to support facilities and projects that have physical activity to people who maybe don't traditionally access physical activity they're not comfortable going to mainstream gyms or playing sport, that sort of thing. And village halls definitely sit within that remit. So again, obviously project specific, but if you're wanting to refurbish your whole floor or you want to put some heating in or whatever it would be, and you can link it to some physical activity groups within the hall, then Sport England would be an option as well. And then finally, as I say, there's hundreds of funds, and it's very, very hard to kind of say these are the 30 funds to go and look at within Cambridgeshire because a lot of it is down to the types of activities that you have at the hall. But a lot of funding is moments in time. So funds will open up and you see them for 2 months and then they're never to be seen again. So it does require a kind of fairly consistent check-in and Google searching of what's available. Um, our kind of stock standard searches will look at parish, town and borough council sites to see if there's any local grant funding available. As good news stories aren't very prevalent at the moment, but there's less going into landfill. Therefore, there's probably the pot for landfill funding is slightly dropping, but there's a lot more funding becoming available from large scale solar and wind farms that are being established. Because even though they are having a good environmental impact generating renewable energy, they do have a detrimental impact in terms of the biodiversity of actually installing those things. So there's those grant funds open. Locally, again, I think it's in its last round. The Black Cat development, and you guys will know this a lot better than I do, but the Black Cat development, National Highways have had a grant fund for around about £1.5 million over the last couple of years that could be applied for. There may be one more round actually in the summer, so that's something worth checking. A variety of charitable trusts. So some large national ones, Asda and Morrison's have charitable arms. Obviously, from their point of view, it's a marketing thing to show that they are putting money into communities. But those programs can be for £10,000, £15,000. Again, may support you depending on your project. There'll be local charitable trusts as well. And then finally, government funding that can be a real big source, big pots of money. Currently, UK share prosperity funding is the way that the government is getting their money out there. The unfortunate thing for, I guess, village halls is that can be rolled out very different in different areas. So the government will release regional funding, but some councils or some authorities will already have things earmarked for that money. other areas will put them into community grant funds that you can then go and apply for and present projects to. So this the government funding in particular can change, obviously, with government change. So it's well worth just keep checking how that is going to change via Google searches. Um, this is absolutely not a sales pitch from our point of view, but it's something that is probably a mainstay of what we do when we do support people is go and do the funding search for them, make them aware of obviously what are the areas that they can potentially apply for. And then more importantly, as grant funds open up, notify them that there's the particular pot of money that they may be applicable for. So outside, obviously, finding the funding, going into just designing the project. So before you're even putting pen to paper, there's some things maybe when you do decide broadly, this is what we're trying to achieve. And looking in the chat, there was a lot of things about energy efficiency upgrades, solar installations, batteries, which seems to be a very, prevalent project for most people at the moment. There's ways you can develop those projects to kind of enhance the chances of success. Um, so the most boring part of our job is reading funders' guidance, and Heidi's pretty much for the last 45 minutes kind of spoke about the lottery's funding guidance. And although it is tedious to go through, it's absolutely vital because to have chances of success, you need to understand what that particular funder is trying to achieve. And by taking that information, you can build a better project for maybe no increase in cost to make sure you marry up with the funders guidance. So the lottery is a good example of there's multiple aims that they've got in there. And just by adding certain elements to a project, it may mean that rather than just meeting one of the funders' aims, you might meet multiple parts of the funders' aims. And I'll give an example of that in a minute. There's nothing off limits. So again, Heidi's helped me massively here because I think she's shown that the lottery will pretty much support any project as long as there's a real strong community need for that particular project that you can evidence. There's nothing off limits. So never be sat, at committee meetings, trustees meetings, thinking, I'm not sure we'll get this grant funded. We're going to have to save up money for the next year, and so on and so forth. You'll typically be able to find a funder that will be able to marry up to a project. So always have the confidence that you might find some grant funding for a particular project. But the additional elements that you can do in your project design. So an example would be we worked with a cricket club that was creating an external sort of seating terrace, an outdoor terrace. The project was around about just under £50,000. They applied to the Landfill Communities Fund. If you read most of the landfill companies' funding guidance, they like biodiversity elements to be added into projects, however that looks. So they decided that they were going to have drainage coming off the terrace and basically going into a living wall. That ran at the front of the terrace, which was pretty straightforward, just mostly boxing in plants and different living things within that wall. It only added maybe £1,000, £1,500 to the overall project, but when the funder gave them the funding and they were successful, they specifically said because you added this element into the project, it showed that you had a broader understanding of what we were trying to achieve and really got it over the line. So that's a good example of you can sort of put a project design together that maybe meets the funder's aims better. And then finally, every funder now wants to see projects that are community led. Now, being on a couple of not-for-profit committees myself, I totally understand that it tends to work that the trustees or committee will sit down and say, reflect on the facilities and say, these are the things that we need to do, which is fine because you're all members of the community yourself. But to kind of take things to the next level and the project to the next level, again, before you put pen to paper, can you consult either some of the community group leaders to understand what they might want to see as part of the project or how it might impact them? Can you even go to the wider community? If you're in a tight village community, have you got communication channels that might be a short survey or just asking questions of the community to see how a project might be adapted to suit their needs even more, because there may be some very, very minor tweaks that you might be able to make to a project to again just enhance that evidence you can provide that the community has been involved in the process. So going into the bid itself, from our point of view, this is almost our scaffolding to our grant applications. And regardless of the question, there'll be the answer will have elements, if not all of these three things within it. So the first thing, talking about the project, so it's quite obvious when we say what's the problem, what's the solution, but you can talk with very surface level detail or depth to this. So if we speak about what's the problem when it comes to, let's say, re-roofing the hall, for argument's sake, you can say, we need to re-roof the hall. It's starting to be damaged and we've not replaced it in 30 years. Obviously, that doesn't create any uniqueness to the problem and gives a very surface level example of what's going on. If you can speak about the slate's fallen off, there's water ingressing into the cavity, it's starting to create water damage internally to the hall. We've started to have damp or mold issues. We have physical activity groups who are worried about respiratory illness from that damp and mold. It provides a real depth to the problem that really funders then get a very clear picture of what's going on. And similarly to the solution, describe with depth the actual solutions that you're given. So like the question that Martin gave before about the oil heating system, that's a great opportunity to say, this is the solution that we're putting in place, and these are the reasons as to why we're putting this solution into place over and above other things, other than just saying we're going to get a 30% more efficient oil boiler and leave it at that, because again, doesn't give the context. And that is just elements of being specific about the problem and the solution that you're offering. Beneficiaries. So again, most of this is just avoiding surface level discussion. So you're always in a bid going to talk about who uses the hall, what they do, probably how often that they use the hall. But again, you can do that at a surface level. So you could say that a yoga group uses the hall. But probably the next level to explaining the beneficiaries is saying, what's the kind of demographic? Is there a demographic of type of person who is part of that yoga group? Are there any particular challenges that they may have that if that yoga group doesn't happen or their activities have to change that they're going to face? How many people go to that yoga group and how often does it happen, and speak about the total number of activities over the year. So if you can give numbers to that and say 10 people come to the yoga group and they come 50 weeks a year, you can say there's 500 activity sessions over the course of the year, which again just provides that another level of detail that makes things really, really clear in funders' eyes. Linking to local outcomes, I think, is really important. We're going to go in more detail to that. Don't necessarily mean local outcomes of goals of councils or anything like that, but really linking to what the challenges that your particular area faces. And we are going to go into more detail, but I would presume, clue in the name village halls, community centres, a lot of you will probably come from rural communities, and they have their own set of challenges that really need to be communicated, and how the hall's supporting those challenges and addressing those challenges. And then the last bit for beneficiaries and the first point for impact is, if your project doesn't go ahead, more often than not, it means further down the line activities are going to be impacted by that. So if you can talk about, well, there's nowhere else for people to go to access the activities that we do, and if the project doesn't happen, this is how these people are going to be impacted. It provides that future context, future context of where the hall's at. So again, I'm picking up on Martin's point about the oil boiler. The reality is, if they don't address that, they're not going to be at some point be able to heat their hall. So at some point, there becomes a tipping point where all those activities and beneficiaries suffer because of that, and really pushing that point is also important. Um, Measurable outcomes. I wouldn't overuse data and I wouldn't overuse numbers in applications, but measurable outcomes, as Heidi spoke about, of can you say the number of activities, total number of activities that happen in the hall, total number of new activities that might be able to happen after a particular project. Things like carbon savings, if you're going to do an environmental project, putting X amount of solar power on the roof saves X amount of carbon, which, to be honest with you, from our point of view, you can say how much carbon you're going to save, but if you can contextualize that and say that's the equivalent of planting 150 trees, for argument's sake, it gives a real contextual element to some of those outcomes. And then finally, does the project create uh, a foundation for future projects? So a roof is a good example. You know, you may have appetites to install renewable energy, but if you don't have a sound structure to your roof, you can't do that. Can you present an almost a 5-year plan of, we're doing this because we're aiming to do this and so on and so forth? And then, future proofing the building. So, is the project linked to financial sustainability of the hall? Is it linked to environmental sustainability of the hall? Or is it just something that means that you're going to have a facility there for the next 50 years? You know, you're going to install a new stage, for argument's sake, in the main hall. But that's going to be there for 50 years and going to be used by X number of groups over that time period. And it's all things from a funder's point of view, with the assessors that are sat on the opposite side of the table, giving that level of detail will nudge that bid and make it jump off the page because I can't imagine what it's like to sit, every day, read application after application after application, but surely the ones that jump off the page and make it really clear about what the hall's about and the challenges that they're facing is going to be the ones that get funded. So why bids fail? Now, you never get feedback saying it's too boring. No one's as harsh as that. But I think you can see from my previous points about being specific, um, not sort of the terms, things like we're a community hub, we're avoiding, we offer physical and social activities. It kind of, although we all understand what that means, it doesn't really say anything about you. And it doesn't really give, I would presume, the assessor the opportunity to understand what is unique about you, what is unique about your project. So don't be afraid to tell stories. I massively encourage you to not be too intellectual with the application and tell the stories of the hall, tell the stories of the user groups. Don't be afraid to be a bit outside of the box, be a bit kooky with your explanations, because again, it gives the opportunity for the application to jump off the page. And it also, by doing these things, you give a voice to your community and you highlight the real challenges and real life scenarios of what's going on. Um, I'm absolutely over the moon that Heidi's made the point about AI and ChatGPT because it is a tool that we use. We don't use it for bid writing. We use it for research about an area prior to talking to a hall, so we can understand demographically what's going on in the area, so we can have a bit better of a conversation. Um, ChatGPT AI will not produce these stories, this specificity for you. It can edit your language, so you could definitely use it for that purpose if you're not comfortable with grammar or whatever it would be. But you have to put the work in yourself a little bit to put the stories in there, put the community voice in there, first and foremost, and avoid the stuff that ChatGPT does that just gives you generic, overarching summary sentences and all these things that just waste the words in the bid. Um, Evidence and consultation. So I would say that this is the most consistent feedback of when bids fail. Every funder wants to see that what you're putting down on a page is real, and you really want to try and give evidence as best you can that you've made consultations with the community, you've put the time and effort into designing the project to deliver something that's going to have impact, but also deliver something that the community really, really wants to see. And Heidi's mentioned some of these things, but again, every project's different. Everything, some of this stuff fits, some of it doesn't. But the more you can do some of this stuff, so Martin, if you've got an energy report or an energy audit and something that backs up your point about really oil being, the only real option to go down when it comes to heating the hall, put those reports in the application. If you can't attach them to the application, be very explicit that you've had them done. Um, if you can use your Facebook page to prove that you've actually done that stuff, then all the better. Community surveys. So I would say it's a good process to maybe just have a community survey running every year annually that's just broad. Doesn't have to be about your project, but it might be generally about your facilities, people who use it, the things that they want to see. Um, Letters of support for the project that from the people who it's going to impact the most. So it again gives the voice of those people rather than you saying the words for them. You can evidence that those people actually back the project and the real life impact that it's going to have on them. Um, and then, we always talk about community involvement. There's a number of ways they can either have come up with a need for the project, they can be involved in the design of the project, and they can be involved in the delivery of the project. And one example of that recently we've had is a scout hut that we supported. They wanted to put a solar installation in, but in terms of the actual delivery, the generation of the project, the scouts themselves were significantly involved in that because they had an environmental badge as part of their program. So they not only obviously got involved with the need of the project, but they learnt about what renewable energy does for buildings. They were involved with understanding how big the system size should be, and then finally involved, I suppose, in the delivery of the project because their education system and the badge at the end of it meant that they were sort of involved in the holistic project. So not every project allows that level of community involvement, but those are sort of examples of how you can sort of really get that bid to the next level just with a little bit of additional work. And then finally, the local context, which I touched on earlier. So again, I know there'll be maybe community centres from some more urban areas, but I'm sure there's plenty of people on the call that are, village halls in smaller communities, rural communities, village communities. And when we meet those people, often we get the comment of, well, we struggle for funding because we're not really in an area of deprivation, we're not really in an area of sort of multicultural area, or we don't really have a subset of people that people want to support, which I believe isn't true. I think village communities do have a number of different things that they face, that access to services and rural deprivation really is significant. And what socioeconomic areas and urban areas do have is access to a lot of services and a lot of support because naturally a lot of funding go into their areas. What a lot of village communities don't have is access to those services, whether it's a GP practice, whether it's a gym, whether it's whatever it would be, social facilities. And that's a real challenge, and it's becoming more and more of a problem within the country. So communicating that as part of your bid, if you are in a rural area, is also vital because it just adds that another layer of context to why a project is particularly important. Things like being, most villages are changing to become more older because young people may not be able to afford the house prices, so they move out or they go and move for work purposes. Therefore, communities become more older, and potentially things like poor transport links, people don't drive, maybe there's not great bus services, means that the hall becomes the absolute lifeline to those particular villages and those communities. And again, being very explicit about that, talking about what are the bus links that come into the area, what time, what times that they come, and the challenges that they present. is something that gives great context to a project. And floodplains is a small example, but again, our experience would be that a lot of village halls and community centres are the refuges for the local community. So if severe weather events occur, power outcuts potentially happened, there's a hall there where people can go, and yeah, potentially use as a safe space. That's really applicable to anything like a solar application, battery storage, because you can power that hole under under emergency conditions. But also, if you're doing an environmental project, if you've got issues with flooding, for argument's sake, in the area, there's a second order consequence of your project whereby you're in a small part reducing the environmental burden of your facility and therefore potentially reducing climate crisis and that exasperating. So again, all those things kind of stack up to, rather than generally just explaining the situation, there's a number of, I guess, specific points when it comes to rural communities that can back up that need. Um, so finally, just an example of, and again, this isn't a sales pitch, but ways in which we've supported a local entity in Cambridgeshire. So Swavesey Community Pavilion, we've supported with a couple of applications whereby it's a small entity, sort of in a village that's in between St Ives and Cambridge, and they sort of came to us because from a volunteer time point of view, they were very, very poor. There was a number of projects they wanted to do for a period of time that they just didn't feel like they had the volunteers to kind of get the applications in and do the work necessary. And had a couple of projects. First one being an internal refurbishment, putting energy efficiency upgrades into the hall, that were fairly low cost solutions, but we're going to reduce their energy demand and make them more environmentally and financially sustainable, and also some refurbishment works to the kitchen. Secured that funding, and then that allowed them then to move on to another application for a solar installation. And what they did was allow to evidence, I guess, that foundation of, we've established this within the hall, and now it means that we can go and generate our own energy, because we've exhausted our efficiency efforts, and by installing it, it again takes them up to the next level of environmental sustainability, but also allowed them to be this off-grid, not fully off-grid, but off-grid entity whereby they can generate their own energy, store their own energy, and again, that links to some of the things we've just spoke about being a refuge and a sustainable entity. Um, so yeah, hopefully, uh, in a fairly succinct way, we do an in-house training session every week, and we could probably fill 5 days worth of information here on all the sort of different funders and things that are out there and how to put different applications together based on the project. But hopefully that gives you a few little pointers that are useful. Um, we are a very much an open book. We're more than happy to give free advice. We're more than happy to be on the end of emails if people do have odd questions that you working on your applications yourself and you just want any clarity on things. We're very much not salespeople. We operate on a success basis, so people who do work with us know that there is no financial commitment to working with us unless they actually realise the project and complete the project, which means that we don't have to sell because there's no upfront commitment. So we're more than happy to chat to you about projects that you have, even if you're thinking ultimately you're going to go and do those projects and funding applications yourself. Um, and we do work with people who initially get us to sort of support them for a couple of applications, then take it on once they get more confident with the process. So yeah, any questions, anything that you'd prefer to ask outside of sort of the next 10-15 minutes, then feel free to contact us. We are, although we're northwest based, so we're based in Lancashire, we do get out and about and visit halls all over the country. So again, we'd like to have a day or a couple of days per year where we come to Cambridge and go out and visit 4 or 5 halls in the day and chat through any projects that they might want to look at. So obviously, if you'd be interested in that, then contact us as well. And finally, we are at the event Ollie that I think's in March.
Yeah, that's right. I was just going to say that. I think you've kindly agreed to come along to our community buildings conference next month.
Yeah.
So yeah, 17th of March at the Burgess Hall in St Ives.
Yeah, yeah. So again, if things can wait until then come and give us a shout whilst we're there. So sort of that's everything. If there's any questions, I can't actually. I'm going to stop sharing just so that I can see the chat.